we're here to bring a new type of news show.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Bringing news just for you. It's Wednesday, February 4th here in Seoul. I'm Isujin, and this is News Generation. Joining us today is Cheska.
Happy Wednesday, everyone.
Happy Wednesday. Also, Wonbing's with us.
Morning.
Good morning. And both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s. So as we head into the middle of the week, it's a moment to check in on how we live day to day. And interestingly, both of our panelists today are living alone as one-person households. So living on your own comes with a lot of freedom, but also a lot to think about. From safety to loneliness, from daily routines to unexpected emergencies, there's always something on your mind. So Cheska, let me ask you this. What's the one thing you're afraid of when it comes to living alone?
Sujin, I can't just tell you one thing.
There
is a list of things, and I've lived alone for about 7-8 years now. So
I see.
I actually have a list of things that I'm always afraid of, or at least is on my mind. I mean, to start with the basics, bugs, pests,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Sudden appearance of roaches, God forbid.
A very relatable one.
Very scary, but also something very important as security and privacy, because as a girl living alone, I think these are some of the most important issues. But also medical emergencies, because sometimes if something as small as like choking on a food were to happen, it's very difficult to perform a Heimlich on your own,
right.
or like call an emergency service. So these are some of the things that come up, and also existential crisis. I think solitude sometimes hits really hard, but you look around the room and you realize you're the only one there to solve the problem. So sometimes those hit really hard too, yeah.
So since you've been living alone for 8 years, do you have any like systems in place to help you deal with those situations?
That's a really good question, because now that you mention it, I realize I actually don't. Which I think is really important, because as a young people, we don't think about those emergencies as being so prominent.
Right.
So I don't think we have those in place as much. So I think it is really important. Yeah, I actually don't.
Right, especially for medical emergencies.
Yeah.
You think about it, but you don't think it's actually going to happen to you.
Exactly, exactly. So maybe that is what we should talk about today. Yeah.
Right. So what about you, Wonbing?
Yeah, similar with Cheska, because I'm still statistically on the younger side of the demographic. I don't have that many concerns or serious concerns at the moment. But the problem is when I get older. So, you know, something that is simple and something that's not a risk to us, to people who are in their 20s, 30s, and even 40s, can be an uncertainty or something unsafe for the seniors and the elderly. For example, you know, slippery bathroom floors, or cooking and forgetting to turn off the stove once you're done. And another big concern that I have for living alone is isolation and loneliness. It could lead to lonely death, so that's a worry that I have for the future as well.
So I think all of this is really an honest take, and it shows how concerns can change as we age, and that highlights how loneliness can be just as dangerous as physical risks. So we're going to talk more about this, but first, let's take a look at the screen. As one-person households continue to rise, living alone is becoming a new normal for many. For some, it represents freedom and independence, but for others, it can mean isolation and silence. And for some, that isolation leads to a growing social concern: lonely deaths, cases in which individuals pass away alone. On today's News Generation, we examine why lonely deaths are increasing, the prevention measures already in place, and what more can be done to better protect those at risk. So as we just saw in the video, concerns are growing about lonely deaths as the number of one-person households continues to rise. And different countries are responding in different ways. But before we dive more into this, Cheska, can you tell us what lonely deaths are and any unique or notable prevention efforts that stand out to you?
So first of all, a lonely death refers to a situation where someone passes away alone and remains undiscovered for a long period of time. Now, while this issue has often been associated with the elderly, now it also includes, as we'll talk about in today's episode, young people living alone as well, especially in large cities like Seoul, where social isolation is growing. Now, overseas, there have been some notable prevention efforts. For example, in China, there's a mobile app literally called Are You Alive? And what it does, it has gained popularity because users are actually required to check in every 2 days to confirm if they are okay and alive. Now, if they fail to do so, an alert is automatically sent to a pre-registered registered emergency contacts and is actually one of the most downloaded paid app in the country, which I think highlights the importance of how young people are feeling about being lonely and alone. And single-person households living away from family is also growing in a lot of big cities, which is why I think some of these apps are also growing as well. And what stands out is that this approach does not wait for a crisis to happen. So, Jin, like you mentioned, it's kind of a preemptive method. Yeah, it's like an emergency contact. So it creates a sort of a routine form of connection, reminding people that someone will actually notice if somebody disappears or is like out of contact for a while. So I think it is very important.
And I think you might be able to attest to this better, but I'm guessing younger people aren't actually scared of dying itself. It's more like knowing that someone's there, someone cares, there's an emergency contact.
It's like, is there someone on the other side who is aware of what is happening to me, right?
I think that's also really meaningful. So all this shows how real this fear has really become, but it's not limited to one country. It's not just limited to China. So how's fear of lonely death become now a global issue?
Yeah, so while the number of lonely deaths has been increasing globally, Korea's number is also steadily increasing since 2017, which is when Korea began to release the official stats for lonely deaths in Korea. And unfortunately, in 2024, which is the most recent data that we have for now, it has again reached a record high again. Now, to get a better understanding, let's take a look at the stats. So according to the Ministry of Health and Welfare of Korea, the number of lonely deaths was 3,279 in 2020, 3,378 in 2021, 3,559 in 2022, 3,661 in 2023, and lastly, 3,924 in 2024, which is approximately an 8% increase from the previous year. Now, if we break down the stats even further, men's lonely death was 5 times more frequent than women, and they were mostly middle-aged people or seniors, and over half of them were in the lowest income group as well.
Right, so those figures reveal who's most at risk right now, and the picture is changing. So how is lonely death affecting younger generations? Usually it's associated with the elderly population.
Right, and this is, I think, quite unfortunate because as we saw in the stat Wonbin mentioned, most of it, the overall rate of lonely death is still higher among the middle-aged and older adults. But what's concerning is that the number of people in their 20s and 30s continue to rise, making this a growing social issue. And I mean, in fact, surveys have shown that people in their 30s actually perceive their own risk of dying alone at around 40%, which actually made it the highest among all age groups. And another worrying trend is the cause of death. The younger of the age group, the higher the proportion of death related to suicide. Now, among lonely death cases, suicide actually accounts for almost 60% of people in their 20s, which is very, very sad because this is the youngest age group, and about 43% in their 30s. Now, this suggests that for many young adults, lonely death isn't just about living alone. It is closely tied to mental health struggles, social isolation, and I think a lack of support system during some of the most unstable years of life, especially in those 20s. If you look at the rate of suicide, it's not so much a cause of illness or physical ailment. It is, I think, has to do with a lot of mentality and loneliness that comes with it. Yeah.
Right, I mean, the fact that people in their 30s are making up the biggest portion is quite significant. And it challenges the idea that it's not only, it's only an older age issue. So what's driving this overall rise? Why are lonely deaths increasing?
So again, the Ministry of Health and Welfare explained this with a few reasons, starting with the rise of single-person households and the aging society. And moreover, they also mentioned the loss of connection between people and neighbors due to digitalization of the world and the implementation of many contactless services such as delivery and digital services since COVID-19. So it seems like it's the reasons are multiple situations combined rather than a single evil cause driving the number of lonely deaths up.
Right, so these changes are reshaping daily life, and what's noteworthy is that young people are starting to feel this shift along with the elderly population. So Why are younger adults, would you say, vulnerable to lonely deaths, Jessica?
I think there are a couple of more psychological reasons. While the overall rate of lonely deaths is still higher, as we mentioned, among middle-aged and older adults, I think what's concerning is that the people in the younger age group face a lot of social issues. For instance, job pressures, trying to look for employment, and also social alienation that happens as we age. But I think one of the things that we also stand out is that we live in a society and a culture where it's difficult to ask for help. And especially when you're young, independence is sort of prioritized. So reaching out for help becomes almost difficult. So for a lot of young adults and young people, they sort of hold on to their mental issues, hold on to their social issues, and let it breed until it gets to a point of no return.
Right, so it sounds like many young people are isolated long before anyone notices, and that suggests a clear gap in current prevention efforts. So to gain a global perspective on this, we're going to talk to someone in Japan where lonely deaths are also considered a social epidemic. And that conversation will take place right after the break, so don't go anywhere.
NewsGen wants to hear from you. Go to YouTube and search out channel Arirang News. Click Posts and cast your vote in the poll. Make a new type of news with us.
Joining us today is June Choi, who lives in Japan, a country also known for battling a lonely deaths crisis. Hello, June. Thank you so much for connecting with us today.
Hi, honored to be here.
Okay, so I know you're also living alone, so you're the best person to ask this question. So how serious would you say is the issue of lonely deaths in Japan today?
Based on my experience of living in Japan, I would say lonely death is very real and is an increasingly serious social issue that we have here. It's not openly talked about in conversations but we do see it quite frequently in the news. I believe this is increasing public awareness. Well, as we see a lot of news cases of elderly people unfortunately passing away alone in their homes and were discovered much later. But the more unfortunate part is that these kind of reports, if you live in Japan, feels very routine and common. Like this sense of normalization really shows how widespread this issue actually is. And Japan, at the end of the day, is a very rapidly aging society like Korea, and the number in single-person households are continuously increasing. So if I were to conclude, I would say lonely deaths are not just an individual circumstance that happens in this country anymore. I feel like it reflects a broader social isolation and also weakening community connections in modern day Japan.
Thank you for sharing your insight, because as you talked about, normally lonely death was associated with elderly or the older age group. But as you saw in the episode today, we're talking about how it affects younger people as well. So how big of a concern are lonely death among young people in Japan?
I would say the issue itself is quite big, but the concerns that young people have in Japan are relatively small. When we see the actual cases of lonely deaths in the news, it is much more common among the elderly, and youth cases are somewhat rare in Japan. So I feel like some youth consider themselves as not the main group that are affected by this and could lead to lack of awareness or seriousness. But when it comes to the conditions that could lead to lonely deaths, I think it could potentially derive from life habits among young people in Japan. A lot of young adults move to larger cities like Tokyo for work and school and are living alone in small apartments. Despite living in densely populated areas, I think socially and culturally, it is very unusual to have social interaction with neighbors. And not just that, if you're living in Japan, you can't avoid the work-centered lifestyle. Long working hours and strong focus on work could possibly limit their social interaction outside the workplace. And for some people, colleagues may be the only contact that they have on a daily basis. So if I were to summarize, I think lonely death overall is still quite rare from young people in Japan, and that could lead to lack of awareness. But there is this quiet and hidden isolation that exists, and that's why I believe these social tendencies in Japan could lead to this unfortunate phenomenon.
It's interesting to hear how similar Japan is to Korea right now. Now, last question for you. What kinds of policies or systems are in place in Japan to prevent lonely deaths?
I was able to do a bit of research, and based on my understanding, Japan does introduce a lot of various prevention measures on a local government and community level. For example, municipalities operate this mimamori, or best translated as watchover services that assist elderly residents with regular check-ins by community volunteers, local welfare offices, and technological support like smart meters that can detect unusual inactivity. Although this issue is being tackled when it comes to older populations, from a young person's perspective, it feels very limited in scope and is not really visible in daily life. And the support for isolated young people is not really common. And for us, it's kind of unclear where to turn for help in case of an emergency. And although awareness is gradually increasing, the current measures kind of focus responding after isolation is somewhat already severe. So that's why I feel like there is a strong need in Japan to have preventive approaches that encourage everyday social connection to people of all ages so that they can get more engaged with their communities.
I mean, yeah, it's quite interesting to hear how, because the same problems exist in Korea too, where there's not enough preventive efforts and there's most of the systems are geared towards elderly people. So I guess we know where the discussions should be held on. So thank you so much for joining us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we just heard from someone who lives in Japan about the seriousness of the lonely deaths crisis, the issue of lonely deaths among younger people, and the preventive policies and systems in place to address this problem. So South Korea's government is also taking the steps to address this. So what measures are being taken to prevent lonely deaths here in Korea, Jessica?
Yeah, so in South Korea, in response to the rising numbers, the government has recently introduced a, quote, lonely death crisis response system. And this system is designed to identify people at risk much earlier, like we talked about, preemptive and preventive, especially those who may have previously been outside of the radar, and connect them with counseling, monitoring, and preventive support before isolation becomes life-threatening or at the point of no return.
So there's a clear need to address lonely deaths as a broader social issue, but there is still more to be done. So what more is being done to expand lonely death prevention efforts?
Now, outside of the government programs, there are also some private programs as well. For example, there's a milk delivery campaign where people volunteer and visit elderly and check in with them while delivering milk for free. It's a very soft way to soften the visit from checking if you're alive or checking if you're okay to building a genuine connection as a human to human. However, for these private programs and campaigns, there are limits due to resources and time. And also, like we just talked about throughout the interview, it's a little bit more geared towards the elderly. So for the younger generations, we do feel a little bit left out in terms of these campaigns or programs.
But I guess, as you mentioned earlier in the show, after COVID, there's been an increase in contactless interactions. So I guess that is something to help with that at the same time. So the milk delivery campaign is a thoughtful way to check on the elderly, but the system, as Wonbi mentioned, is still limited to the elderly population. So what additional efforts are needed to prevent lonely deaths, especially for youths, in your opinion, Jessica?
You know, today's episode actually brought a lot of thoughts for me because I never actually thought about lonely death as a young population. But I think ultimately, we need a system that don't just respond after something happens, but one that can actively check in. And I think this could mean expanding mental health access because those are the main cause of young death, creating low barrier counseling and building a community space where people actually can come without the stigma or pressure just to connect and talk to people. But I think beyond policy, there's also a social responsibility that we need to talk about. And I think it's to normalize reaching out and calling out for help. Because I'm also one of those people, but sometimes it's really difficult to say, hey, I just need a moment of your time, or like I need some help, because we are taught to be more independent, especially in a hyper-competitive society where independence is something prioritized. And this mentality of standing on your 2 feet is something that we should grow into. But I think when we live in a society, the whole point is to be able to rely on someone and also offer help and support. So I hope we can build that society so that lonely death doesn't become too lonely at the end of the day. Yeah.
Well, you know what, Jessica? I'm always available for you. If you need anyone to talk to, I'm always here.
Yes. This is the reason why we should talk about it openly,
You more raise awareness.
Yes, Wonbi, can I contact you too?
Of course. I'm here as well, don't worry.
I'm kidding. Thank you though, thanks.
And one way to talk about how or get ideas of how to deal with this problem to see how other countries are tackling the problem. So what are some systems that you think can be applied to Korea that's being done overseas?
Yeah, so I've brought some of the more traditional examples because although we just discussed that it's important to support the isolated youth as well, but I think as a government, as a society, it is inevitable for the seniors and the elderlies to be the priority. So I was hoping that if Korea is able to implement and build a strong foundational support for the elderlies, it will naturally lead to other programs and campaigns that will help the youths as well. So in terms to build the foundation for the seniors and elderlies, I brought some examples that we can benchmark. In France, there is an organization called Mona Lisa, which is the name Mona Lisa, but apparently it's actually an acronym for certain words as well, which calls and visits isolated single-person households. And in Denmark, they actually utilize residential communities to prevent people from being isolated and living alone. And overall, I think, like I mentioned at the beginning, I think Korea has a lot of room for improvement in terms of program, welfare campaigns to support the elderly, and furthermore to support the youth as well.
Right, so living alone is becoming more common, but no one should have to face life or death alone. From government systems to community programs, meaningful efforts are already underway, but more is clearly needed. We must strengthen support networks, create inclusive prevention policies, and make a habit of checking in on our neighbors and those around us. By staying connected and taking responsibility as a community, we can hopefully prevent lonely deaths. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of News Generation. But News Gen will be back tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Korea time with more stories and discussions. A big thanks to Cheska.
Pleasure's always mine. Thank you.
And also Wonbin.
Thank you for having me.
And to our viewers, thank you so much for tuning in. And we hope you check on your loved ones today. So we are News
Generation.